Hello. Thank you all for being here. I really, really appreciate it. I know there are folks in this room who've lost people recently, this 6 months, this year, even this week. So I'd love if we could just take a moment of silence to honor those that we've lost. So thank you, I really appreciate it. Jonathan Opp and I used to work together, and I was really excited to find out he was taking over Creative Mornings. I was hopeful at some point he might ask me because it seemed like it'd be a cool opportunity. And then he approached me and he's like, yeah, I really want you to talk about this topic. It's death. And I was like, okay, not the easiest, not the lightest on a Friday morning. Catherine Schultz, who's a great writer, says, though, that we do not make it to the end, right? We live in the present, and we live here and now. So I'm going to actually start this story at some point with life. I grew up in Western North Carolina, and I made it to Chapel Hill, go Hills, in 2004. And a few years later, I had the great fortune of working on a political campaign, where I got to know folks in this room, including Joyce, but where I also got to know my wife, Jamie, who I will show you in just a moment. Chapel Hill was a wonderful place, and the campaign was a wonderful opportunity. And she and I met, I think it was 3 weeks into this campaign in 2007. Jamie grew up in Orangeburg, South Carolina. And in Orangeburg, she had a teacher mother who taught her to believe in service, who taught her that we really had to, no matter how little or much we had, think about how we gave back. And she drew a straight line between that work and the work of politics. She ran for student body president, and she lost. But like most women, she decided to get things done anyways. And so as vice president, she got things done, and she realized that she wasn't going to be done with politics as a result. So she went off to college. So I'm going to go to this photo. This is us on our wedding day. So we got married in 2009. But let's start with the beginning of the story. I was an intern on this campaign. And I showed up my first day, anxious to volunteer, really interested in the work ahead. And they said, okay, well, you have to meet Jamie. She really needs someone to help her. So they walked me around the corner to her cubicle, and she turned around and with the biggest, broadest smile, welcomed me. And I don't know if love begins in an instant or if love begins at first sight, but certainly I believed then instantly that this was going to be someone who meant so, so much to me. And within a few weeks, I realized that she meant way more than just a friend, but she also happened to be 2.5 years older, and she was making money, and I was still in college, and so I was a little intimidated by that. And so I basically spent the next, 8 months just having an enormous crush. On my 21st birthday, I did tell her I love her for the first time, and we'll just leave it at that. She loved me back, I will say, but I don't know if it was in the same way, at least not at first. So as this campaign winds down, she left to go work on another one, and I was still working to the bitter end, and the campaign ended, and she came back one night, and that night we kissed at Milltown in Carborough. Don't know if any of you have ever been there. Magical place. I'd like to think that it was just like electric from that moment forward, and it really was, but again, I was in college, right? But she was a good sport, right? So she's working, she's living in Greensboro, working on Senator Kay Hagan's campaign, and she kept driving back and forth. So this picture actually is from poker night at my house. She went out 7th, I went out 6th. This was her displeasure at not beating me. And then we moved to Raleigh a couple years later. And a month after we moved to Raleigh, we got married. This is us at Beasley's. Not long after Beasley's opened, actually. I was skinnier then because I hadn't ate at Beasley so much. And we had a good life in Raleigh. Jamie was always volunteering. You know, she joined the YMCA and instantly became a mentor. In fact, she tweeted that she mentored on Monday evenings because she knew she had to have something to look forward to start the week. She started her own business, so shout out to entrepreneurs. She believed in mentoring young women, and she did that to the best of her abilities. She worked on political campaigns. She worked for nonprofits. She adopted way too many animals. We had 2 cats and 2 dogs. I was allergic to cats, still am, but it was okay. And we lived life. You know, we became engaged in this community, and we fell in love with Raleigh. It's easy to fall in love with. And we believed deeply in this community, and we were so welcomed here. She was from Orangeburg, South Carolina. I was from Lenore, North Carolina, which almost no one's heard of, although there's a few Lenore people here. And yet, in just a few short years, we made this place home. And the quote I shared at the beginning of this slide that you couldn't read is Joan Didion, who said, "Life changes in the instant, the ordinary instant." And I take that to be true. I mean, it's true in ways that are great. You know, you walk into a place and you meet someone who changes your life for the better. You walk into a place and you get a job opportunity. You walk into a place and you decide that that place isn't for you and you're going to move. But it also can change in a terrible instant. So in April of 2013, my wife and I were attacked, and she did not make it. And that's where the end came from, this concept of death. You know, the truth is, Didion in her book, The Year of Magical Thinking, talks about this. We think that the funeral is the worst thing. We think that even the last moments are the worst thing. And the truth is, they're not. They're the beginning of the worst thing. But it's a journey. It's a journey that no one wants to be on. It's a club that no one wants to be a member of. And all we can do in that, and all we can do in death, when touched by it, is choose to live. And to try to find purpose, and to try to find meaning, and to try to remember the amazing moments that brought you to that place. There are so many quotes about grief being exactly like love, right? There's this saying that I think C.S. Lewis talks about where he refers to grief as almost like a waterfall. But it's filling a basin that's as deep and as wide as your love. And I think that that's true. There are so many people who lifted me up in those initial days and weeks and months, so many people in this room for whom I owe an enormous debt of gratitude. But it's also this city that lifted us up. And that's why I'm still here. That's why I chose to call Raleigh home even after the worst. So I'd love to just give a round of applause to Raleigh, if you don't mind. And I want to talk a little bit more about how Jamie lived. This photo is like the most representative photo of her that I could find. As Joyce and others who knew her would say, she had a laugh that would fill the room. She knew no strangers. She comforted people in low moments. She lifted them up in high moments. She lived life to the fullest. And everyone always says that, but she really did. She adopted animals. She adopted people. She adopted me. With Thanksgiving coming up, I think back to our last Thanksgiving together where she bought, what I think was like a 20-pound turkey. We had 5 people coming over. She was like, well, you know, people might stop in. We just don't know. Pretty sure she invited the cashier from Whole Foods to join us. And that was true to her. And I will say that one of the things I've learned over these last 4.5 years of grief is that so often the best way to get through the hard days is to remember the good ones. But it's also to remember the lessons that those we've lost impart upon us. And it's to remember that it's not always going to be this sad and this hard. In part because they wouldn't want it to be. Right? I mean, you love someone, you want the best for them. And so on my worst days, I knew that she wanted the best for me, and that got me through. And it'll get you through too. And for those of you in the room who've lost recently or at any point, you would know that to be true. I read a stat this week, and I don't know entirely if it's true, I didn't have time to fact check, that any given year, 2.5 million Americans die. Tens of thousands from disease, 50, 60,000 plus from drug overdoses, 44,000 and counting from gun violence. If you assume that even 2 people, or 4 people, or 10 people miss them, right, and are going through grief, are going through profound grief, then you're talking about 10, 20, 30 million people who are walking these streets, right? Vegas, Charleston, Newtown, Texas. In all of these moments, and I had a friend who also went through a pretty profound loss, and we became friends because I walked in the coffee shop to meet him one day, and he walked up to me, he didn't know who I was, and he goes, "You lost someone, didn't you?" He said, "I can see it in your face." And so it's important to remember how many people that we don't even know are facing these profound losses. And to try to build some path forward for them, I think is really a goal, should be a goal for our whole community. And it certainly should be a goal if you're a friend to someone. I will say that, a few months later I saw him and he said, "Your face looks better now, I see it in your eyes." And then maybe a year ago I saw him, he said, "You look better across the board. I know it still hurts, but I'm so, so proud of you." And it really is a journey, right? One of the things I want to talk about just for a second are the way that other cultures grieve. I think in America, do a really shitty job of grieving. I think we do a really, really bad job of it. We're scared of it, right? And it's something to be scared of. But that's not the only way. There are Irish wakes where they celebrate. There is this emerging tradition in South Africa called the After the Tears Party, where the friends and the family get together and they try to celebrate. In Indonesia, in one region, they literally save up for years to hold a community-wide party in the aftermath. So it doesn't have to be this way. But what I want to show you real quick is one of the only uniquely American funeral traditions, which is the New Orleans jazz funeral. So, New Orleans jazz funeral. So the whole idea of that is that you really begin with somber music. You begin with hymns, you begin with, all the saints coming in, and then you play the rowdiest, loudest song possible at the last minute. Because you want them to have one last dance. I think that is so freaking awesome. I told my friends, I was like, when I die, I really, really hope that you'll make sure that we have a New Orleans jazz funeral in Raleigh. And you're all invited. I hope it's like decades from now, just so you know, but you're all invited. I want to talk about resilience for a minute. Resilience is something that you don't know you have until you're faced with a moment where you have to be resilient. It's just a fact. It's what the research shows. My friend Molly, my colleague, has done a lot of research into this, and I think she'll tell me I'm right. You've maybe heard some conversation of this. Sheryl Sandberg's Option B wrote about it pretty recently. Has anyone read Option B? A great book. She speaks in that book of the 3 Ps, what psychologists say you have to sort of work through to sort of build your resilience, right? There's pervasiveness. You have to understand eventually that this loss of a job, this loss of life, is not everything. It may feel like it, but it's not everything. It's not connected to every part of your life. You will, in fact, have happy moments again. She talks about permanence, and the psychologists do too. You feel like you will always feel this way. And, there's some research that shows that when you're a kid, one of the reasons why life moves slowly is because everything is new. And so you're constantly having new experiences. And I'll say that in the first 6 months of grief, it was so slow. Every day was so long. And then one day you're like walking down the street and you look up and you think, God, it's a beautiful day. And then you take a few more steps and you look around and you think, God, I never thought I would say that again. Because you've tapped into something, right? You found some way, some moment to be resilient. And then she talks about personalization. You blame yourself. You think, if only I'd been there, if only I'd answered the call, if only I had told them to go to the doctor, if only I had driven them to the hospital sooner. And you have to work through that, too. I've had people ask me when I speak on grief or when I speak on loss, well, what can we do? There's what we can do for our people. There's what we can do for our family. And then they ask, well, what can we do for our community? And part of it is really focusing on building resilience. What does that mean? Well, you can start from birth. There's a lot of research that goes into this. You can start in the schools. You can make sure that we have counselors, and you can make sure that we have nurses, and you can make sure that our teachers don't just assume the student's challenging them, but instead ask, what's going on? And so I've advocated for and lobbied for people for this state, for this county, for other counties to invest in resilience work from birth. Because we're all gonna face unimaginable losses. And so all we can do as a community is invest in building resilience early. So, definition of resilience: adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. This is American Psychological Association's definition. So one of the things that's important to understand about resilience, and again, this is something that's really bubbling up in the community now, is that it's not just you bounce back. Because trauma is not the event, right? There are traumatic events. Trauma is how your brain continues to react, how your brain responds. Because when you go through trauma, you're given sort of these toxins, this stress that just carries. And in that, you do have and can have a fight, flight, or freeze mentality, right? It's why kids shut down who have trauma in their lives. It's why kids act out. It's why, you can be triggered. It's why PTSD happens. And yet, it's something that can be built. That's the really inspiring thing, I think. The science shows you can absolutely learn how to be resilient. And that's a really encouraging thing for us all. So I encourage you, when you go home, to think about how can we as a community build resilience? What investments can we make? Charlie, the politician in the room, what investments can we make? But I want to sort of jump ahead and so we can leave some time for questions and talk about a few life lessons. In some ways, these may be answers to commonly asked questions that I receive. First of all, when you lose someone, it's natural to feel like life will never get better. But as I said earlier, it does. It just takes time. But there's always going to be moments. There's always going to be songs or dates or places that take you back there. and that's okay. In many ways, you honor the life that was lost by living and by really embracing the full spectrum of emotions: anger, happiness, learning to love again, laughter. I mean, I can remember the first time I laughed really deeply, and I slapped my hand over my mouth, and I felt so very guilty. And I had to stop and wonder why, and I had to stop and realize that that's not what Jamie would have wanted. And I had to learn to be okay with the anger too, right? Anger at God, anger at the world, anger at the person that attacked us, anger at the ambulance for not getting there quick enough. And I had to get deep down in the mud and wrestle with that because it's the only way out. Another thing is, when you lose, because you will, learn to be honest with yourself and others about how you're feeling. You know, Jamie's dad told me one time, he said, I really don't know what to say when people come up and say, how are you? How are you doing? He's like, because if I say I'm doing well, that's not true. It feels like a betrayal. If I say I'm doing shitty, they feel shitty for having asked. So what can I do? And C.S. Lewis has this great quote where he says, you see someone approaching that you know, and you want them to say something, and you don't want them to say something at the same time. But what I learned and what a dear mentor taught me is that you just have to be honest. And she learned this lesson. She had lost her husband, and she was in the grocery store, and this little old lady asked her how she was doing. She said, I'm doing well, thank you for asking. She pushed her cart down, and then she turned around and she said, actually, you know what? I'm doing really, really bad. I'm not having a good day. But I sincerely mean thank you for asking. And it uncorked something in her. And from that moment forward, she knew that the only way forward was to be truthful. Because if someone asks you and they really mean it, then they're going to be okay with you being in a bad place, in a sad place. And if they don't mean it and they ask it for themselves, well, that's not your responsibility. Your job is not to make them feel better. People ask me, will call me sometimes and will say, a friend lost someone. Where do I go now? What do I do? And I always tell them a few things. One, don't leave it up to them to determine what you should do. Don't say, let me know if I can do anything. Even if you really mean it, because what it's saying to them is that they have to contact you to ask for something. Just do something. Make a donation. Drop a care basket off. Put flowers on the grave. Do something to let them know that you care. That's really all they're looking for. There's no silver bullet. You're not going to make things better, but you can be there. I always tell them, always ask how they are doing, but stress this point. Ask them, how are you really doing? And tell them it's okay if they don't want to answer. And tell them it's okay if they don't want to talk about it. That matters a whole lot, right? I tell people to remember when you lose someone that just because life goes on for others 3 and 6 and 9 months down the road doesn't mean they've forgotten the person that you loved. And it doesn't mean you're forgotten. That's sometimes hard to recall. I remember my therapist telling me once, he said, Nation, because I was telling him, I'm constantly talking about it, even when I don't want to, because everyone keeps coming up to me. He said, well, how would you feel if no one came up to you? And it was just such an important reminder. But he also said, just because someone doesn't ask doesn't mean they don't care. It just might mean they're afraid. I don't know. I will say, just in closing, and then glad to take questions, that 4.5 years later, I'm doing pretty well. I'm doing way better than I ever thought I would be. And it's not just because of me or something that I did. It's because of a lot of people in this room who loved me when I was unlovable, who lifted me up when I needed it, who made me get out of bed when I didn't want to, who didn't ask if I needed something, who just showed up, chose to believe in me when I didn't believe that I could find a way forward. And I think like the last lesson I'll leave you with, and the lesson that Jamie taught me, but also the lesson that grief has taught me, is that showing up is the thing that matters most. In moments big and in moments small, and showing up not just in body, right? Not just being there, but being there. And being open to the hard shit, and being open to happiness, and being open to love, and being open to laughter. And realizing that life is all we have, right? It is ultimately, as Sean Didion says, life is for the living. And so we have to get after it, because while, as she says in this quote, I'm going to butcher it a little bit, the grave is a fine place. There's not music there, right? There's not the tidal basin of the Amazon. There's not mountains. There are not friends. There's not love. And so that's what we have. That is our great opportunity. And so the thing I would leave you with, the thing I would challenge you to do, is to remember that always, and to find meaning in these days, because we only have so many of them. So thank y'all.